When a family discards their estranged Vietnam veteran brother's belongings, they believe it's the end of the story. But everything changes when a decorated general from the past shows up on their doorstep with a shocking revelation. What happens when the truth of one man's sacrifice comes to light? Stay tuned, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we share this unforgettable story of respect, redemption, and the power of community. End of trail. Jim Harwell stood in the corner of his childhood home, his hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. The argument in the next room felt louder than it should have been, like an old TV cranked up too high. His sister, Melanie, was going on again, her words sharp and unwavering. "We're wasting time, Brad," she snapped at her husband, her voice ricocheting off the faded floral wallpaper of the dining room. "We've got buyers lined up and he's just sitting here like some squatter. It's ridiculous." Jim didn't need to hear more. He'd heard this conversation too many times in the last month. They called it Dad's house, even though their father had made it clear in his will that Jim could stay as long as he wanted. It didn't matter to them. The land was valuable and the money was all they cared about. For Jim, the house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was the last place that still felt like home. It was where his mother used to hum in the kitchen, where his father spent long hours fixing that old Buick in the garage. It was where Jim had returned after the war, broken and unsure of how to live again. This house had been his sanctuary when the world outside seemed too loud and unforgiving. But his siblings didn't see it that way. To them, Jim was a reminder of their family's dysfunction, a ghost from the past, carrying stories they didn't want to hear. Melanie, with her neatly pressed clothes and her perfect suburban life, didn't care that Jim had served 2 tours in Vietnam. She didn't understand what it felt like to lose brothers in arms, or to come home and feel like a stranger in your own country. "Jim!" Melanie's voice cut through his thoughts as she appeared in the doorway. Her tone was as cold as the glare she gave him. "We've been over this. You can't just sit here forever. Mom and Dad are gone, and it's time to move on. We have a responsibility to sell the property." Jim stared at her, his jaw tight. "It's not about the house. It's about respect. This place—" He gestured around him. "This is all I've got left. You don't get to take that away from me." Melanie sighed, exasperated. "You don't get it. We're doing you a favor. You can't live here forever, Jim. You need to figure out what comes next." "I already had my next once," Jim shot back, his voice rising, "and it was taken from me." For a moment Melanie hesitated, guilt flickering across her face, but then she shook her head, brushing it off. "We've given you time. Too much time. Brad and I will be back tomorrow. The movers are coming, and you need to be ready." Before Jim could argue, she walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The front door slammed, leaving Jim alone in the house. Hours later, Jim sat in the living room, the faint creak of the old rocking chair his only company. Around him, boxes were stacked haphazardly, some half-packed and others untouched. His medals lay on the coffee table, his Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and a faded photograph of his unit. He picked up the photo, his fingers tracing the edges. In it, a younger version of himself stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had become his family in the jungles of Vietnam. In the center was General Samuel Hayes, his commanding officer, a man Jim had admired more than anyone else in his life. Hayes had a way of inspiring loyalty, of making you believe you could survive anything as long as you stood together. Jim placed the photo back on the table and rubbed his temples. He could almost hear the voices of his comrades, joking and bantering during the rare quiet moments they had overseas. But those voices were gone now, just like the house would be soon. He tried to push the thought aside, instead reaching for the box labeled Memories. As he opened it, he found letters he'd written but never sent, journals filled with the chaos of his thoughts, and a small carved figurine one of his buddies had made during downtime. The next morning, Jim woke to the sound of a truck idling in the driveway. He rushed to the front window and saw strangers unloading boxes from the porch. Movers, just like Melanie had promised. His heart sank as he stepped outside. "Hey!" he called out. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" One of the movers looked up from a box he was carrying. "The lady said to clear out the house. Said you'd know. Well, she's no tool." "It's no tool, Eric." Jim's stomach churned. He darted to the curb, where a pile of belongings was already stacked like yesterday's garbage. His medals, his journals, the photo of General Hayes. Panic surged as he scrambled to retrieve them, but his hands shook as he tried to pick up the pieces of his life, scattered on the lawn like debris after a storm. Melanie's car pulled into the driveway, and she stepped out, her expression unreadable. "It's just stuff, Jim," she said coolly. "You need to let go." Jim didn't reply. He couldn't. Instead, he clutched the photograph tightly, his fingers smudging the glass, and walked back into the house without looking back. The old diner smelled like burnt coffee and grease, a mix Jim had come to appreciate since moving into the veterans' shelter. He sat alone in a corner booth, staring at the photograph of his unit, now tucked neatly inside a worn leather frame he'd found at a thrift store. The waitress, a kind woman named Carol, placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "On the house, Jim," she said with a soft smile. "You look like you need it." "Thanks, Carol," Jim mumbled, his voice hoarse. He nodded politely but kept his eyes on the photo. "You should smile more," she teased gently. "That face could scare the devil himself." Jim didn't respond. He simply stared at the faces in the picture, particularly the man at the center, General Samuel Hayes. That photo was his anchor, a reminder that his life had once meant something. Now, it was little more than a relic of a past no one cared about. Across town, General Hayes stood on the edge of the small park by the river. He had taken a rare trip out of the city to clear his mind, but something about the photograph he'd stumbled upon had kept him restless. He pulled it out of his jacket pocket and examined it closely under the soft morning light. The image of his old unit brought back memories he hadn't revisited in years, hard ones, but also ones that reminded him why he had stayed in the military as long as he had. The name scrawled on the back in fading ink was unmistakable: Jim Harwell. Hayes remembered Jim well. He had been one of the best, a sharp thinker and a reliable soldier, even under the worst conditions. But what had happened to him after the war? Hayes had never heard from him again, and now here he was, finding Jim's photo in a trash heap while visiting a friend. The idea unsettled him. He hadn't risen to the rank of general by ignoring things that didn't sit right. Without a second thought, he climbed into his black sedan, the photograph still in hand. He had a hunch where he might find Jim. At the shelter, Jim sat in the small shared lounge with a book open on his lap. He wasn't reading it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the argument with Melanie. Her words had stuck to him like burrs. "It's just stuff, Jim. You need to let go." He thought of all the men he'd served with who didn't make it back, men whose stories lived only in his memories and in the journals he now kept under his cot. If those stories weren't worth something, what was? The shelter director, a young woman named Marie, poked her head into the room. "Jim? There's someone here to see you." He frowned, confused. He didn't get visitors. When he stepped into the entryway, his breath caught in his chest. Standing there, tall and imposing even in his 60s, was General Samuel Hayes. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but the air of command was unmistakable. Jim froze, unsure if he was seeing a ghost or if his mind was playing tricks on him. "Jim," Hayes said, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had decades ago, "you look like you've been through hell." "General Hayes," Jim finally managed to say, his voice cracking. He straightened instinctively, though his posture was stiff from years of wear and tear. "Last time I checked," Hayes replied, stepping forward. He reached out and clasped Jim's hand firmly, his eyes scanning Jim's face as if trying to read everything that had happened since they'd last met. "Let's sit." The two men settled into a quiet corner of the shelter's lounge. Hayes pulled out the photograph and slid it across the table. "I found this in a trash pile," Hayes said, his tone measured but pointed. "I want to know why." Jim took the photo, his hands trembling slightly. "My sister. She doesn't understand," he said, his voice low. She thinks this stuff doesn't matter. She's trying to sell the house. Tossed everything like it was junk." Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "She tossed this?" He tapped the edge of the photograph. "Jim, you've got more commendations than most men I know. This isn't just stuff, it's history." Jim's eyes dropped to the table. "Doesn't feel like it. Not anymore. People like Melanie, they don't care. They just want to move on." Hayes nodded slowly, understanding the pain behind the words. "Well, I care, Jim, and I'm not the only one." Later that evening, Hayes made some phone calls. He had no intention of letting this injustice stand. His first call was to an old journalist friend who specialized in veteran stories. His second was to a group of local veteran advocates. By the time he was finished, he had a plan, a way to ensure Jim's story wouldn't just be another forgotten chapter. The next day, Hayes returned to the shelter, this time with 2 men in tow, a cameraman and a local historian. Together they sat with Jim, asking him about his time in Vietnam, his unit, and the legacy of those who didn't come home. At first, Jim was reluctant, but Hayes's steady encouragement eased his nerves. As the hours passed, Jim's words flowed freely, his stories filling the room with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. By the time the team left, Jim felt something stirring deep within him. It wasn't pride exactly, but something close. A flicker of the man he had once been. He didn't know what Hayes had planned, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. The Harwell family's dining room was uncharacteristically pristine, the table polished to a mirror finish, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Melanie paced back and forth, glancing out the window every few seconds. She had called for this family meeting, hoping to calm Jim down after the blow-up at the house. Brad sat at the head of the table, flipping through his phone, clearly uninterested in whatever resolution Melanie had in mind. "I don't know why you're so nervous," Brad said without looking up. "Jim'll get over it. He always does." Melanie stopped pacing, glaring at her husband. "You don't get it. He's stubborn, and if we're not careful he'll drag this thing out for months. We need him out of that house so we can finalize the sale." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her turn sharply toward the window. "He's here," she said, her voice a mix of relief and impatience. But as the car door slammed and heavy footsteps approached the front door, Melanie frowned. These weren't Jim's footsteps. Too deliberate, too commanding. The doorbell rang sharply, and Melanie hurried to answer it. "Clint." When she opened the door, her breath caught. Standing there in full, formal military attire was an older man with a chest full of medals that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. His stature was imposing, his presence filling the doorway. Behind him stood Jim, looking calm but resolute. "Melanie Harwell?" the man asked, his voice steady and authoritative. "Yes." Melanie stammered, confused. "Who are you?" The man extended his hand. "General Samuel Hayes. I'm here to discuss Jim." "Sir?" Melanie's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Brad appeared behind her, his brow furrowing as he sized up the stranger. "What's this about?" he asked gruffly. Hayes didn't flinch. "It's about respect," he said simply. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, his boots clicking on the hardwood floor. Brad bristled. "You can't just—" "I can," Hayes interrupted, his tone making it clear he wasn't here to debate. "I served with Jim in Vietnam. I've come to remind you of what that service means." The family gathered in the dining room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Hayes placed a leather satchel on the table, opened it, and began laying out Jim's medals and commendations one by one. Each piece of metal caught the light, glinting like a silent accusation. "This," Hayes began, holding up the Purple Heart, "represents wounds your brother endured for this country. He didn't ask for this. He earned it." He placed the medal on the table and picked up the bronze star. "This is for acts of heroism under enemy fire. Jim risked his life not just for his unit, but for his country. Your country. As Hayes spoke, Melanie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Brad crossed his arms, his face a mix of skepticism and irritation. "You don't understand," Melanie started, but Hayes cut her off. "No, you don't understand," Hayes said, his voice rising. "You look at Jim and see a man holding on to the past. I look at him and see a man who has already given more than most ever will. This house, this history, is all he has left. And you think it's just stuff. Shame on you." The room fell silent. Even Brad didn't have a snide remark. Jim sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the table. Hayes wasn't just speaking for him. He was saying everything Jim had wanted to say but couldn't. "All because of Lewis's car crash," he said. Melanie's face softened, guilt creeping into her expression. I didn't mean to disrespect him," she said, her voice shaky. "I just thought—" "You didn't think," Hayes said bluntly. "And that's the problem. You've spent so much time trying to move forward that you've forgotten who helped make that possible." Hayes reached into his satchel and pulled out the photograph of Jim's unit. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward Melanie. "This was in your trash pile. Do you even know what it represents?" Melanie picked up the photo hesitantly, her eyes scanning the faces. "No," she admitted quietly. "It represents brotherhood," Hayes said. "It represents sacrifice. Every man in that picture faced death so that you could sit here today, in this house, and argue about property values." Brad leaned forward, his irritation finally boiling over. "Look, General, I get that you're upset, but this is a family matter. You don't know the whole story." "I know enough," Hayes shot back. "I know that this man, your brother, deserves better than what you've given him." Jim finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "They're not wrong, General," he said. "I've been stuck for years. I should have moved on by now." Hayes turned to him, his expression softening. "Jim, moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean throwing away what matters, and it sure as hell doesn't mean letting people trample over your past." Jim nodded, but his shoulders remained slumped. Melanie looked at him, then at the medals on the table, her eyes welling up with tears. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know how much this meant to you." "You didn't want to know," Jim replied, his tone not unkind but matter-of-fact. "But now you do. So, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. For the first time in years, the Harwell family was forced to confront the weight of their actions, not just toward Jim, but toward the sacrifices he had made. As Hayes stood to leave, he turned to Melanie. "This isn't just about Jim. It's about all the veterans who come home and are forgotten. Don't let him be one of them." With that, he placed a firm hand on Jim's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, soldier. Not anymore." Jim nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, and more importantly, he felt heard. The Harwell family home buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to its usual quiet. The same dining room that had hosted tension-filled arguments was now being prepared for an event none of the Harwells could have predicted. The chairs were rearranged. A table set in the center bore Jim's medals, framed photographs, and carefully preserved letters from his comrades. At the head of the display sat Jim's bronze star and purple heart, their ribbons vibrant against the dark wood. Melanie moved briskly through the house, arranging flowers and vases and adjusting chairs. Her demeanor was different now, less sharp, more focused. Brad, uncharacteristically quiet, followed her lead, setting up a small speaker system in the corner. Jim watched them work from the living room, his arms crossed over his chest. He still wasn't sure how he felt about all this. General Hayes sat beside him, dressed in a sharp blazer and jeans, a deliberate attempt to tone down his formal presence for the evening. He sipped from a mug of coffee, studying Jim with a mixture of pride and understanding. "You nervous?" Hayes asked. Jim shook his head, though his stiff posture betrayed him. "I'm not one for big gestures. This feels like too much." "It's not too much," Hayes said firmly. "You've earned this, Jim. And it's not just about you. It's about setting the record straight. For your family, for this community." Jim nodded, his eyes drifting to the medals on the table. "I just hope they get it." "They will," Hayes said. "They already are." Felix wrote a check. By early evening, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors filed in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and guilt. Many of them had known Jim for years, but none had ever taken the time to truly understand him. Marie, the director of the veterans shelter, arrived with a group of residents, their camaraderie evident in the way they hovered protectively around Jim. One of the first arrivals was a wiry man with a weathered face and a cane. Jim's eyes lit up when he saw him. "Charlie," he called, rising from his seat. The man broke into a grin. "Didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Charlie had served alongside Jim in Vietnam, their bond forged in fire and survival. They embraced tightly, drawing the attention of the room. The sight of the two veterans reuniting sent a ripple of quiet awe through the gathering relationship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the event began. Melanie stood at the front of the room, wringing her hands nervously. This was her idea. A chance to honor Jim properly and, perhaps, to start making amends. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll be honest. Until recently, I didn't fully understand what my brother Jim has been through. I didn't appreciate the sacrifices he made, or how much this house and these memories mean to him. That's on me." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "Tonight is about more than an apology. It's about recognition. Recognition for Jim's service, for his resilience, and for the community of veterans who deserve better than what we've given them." The audience applauded softly, their eyes shifting to Jim, who sat stoically at the side of the room. Hayes rose next, taking Melanie's place at the front. His commanding presence quieted the murmurs in the crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "I'm General Samuel Hayes, retired. I served with Jim Harwell in Vietnam. I could stand here and talk about the missions we completed, the challenges we faced, but tonight isn't about that. Tonight is about honoring a man who carried the weight of those experiences long after the war ended." Hayes gestured to Jim. Jim was more than a soldier. He was a leader, a protector, and a friend. He exemplified courage under fire and compassion in the quiet moments. And when he came home, like so many others, he didn't get the support he deserved. That's a failure, not of Jim, but of us. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It's time we do better, not just for Jim, but for every veteran who feels forgotten. The crowd erupted into applause, some standing in ovation. Jim shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention. Hayes walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to stand. "Say a few words," Hayes said softly. Jim hesitated, but the encouragement in Hayes's eyes pushed him forward. He stepped to the front, his hands gripping the edges of the podium like a lifeline. He looked out at the sea of faces, his family, his neighbors, his fellow veterans, and took a deep breath. "I don't know what to say," he began. His voice was quiet, but the room was silent, hanging on every word. "I've spent a long time thinking what I did over there didn't matter. When I came home, it felt like everyone had moved on, and I didn't know how to fit in," he said. He glanced at Hayes, then at the medals on the table. "But seeing all of you here, it reminds me that it did matter, that it still matters. Not just for me, but for every name on the memorials, every family that lost someone, and every soldier who came back and didn't know how to keep going." His voice broke slightly, but he pushed through. "I'm grateful for my brother Charlie, for General Hayes, and for all of you. It's never too late to make things right." The crowd rose to their feet, the applause swelling and echoing through the room. Jim stepped back, his chest tight with emotion, and Hayes gave him a firm nod of approval. Later that night, as the last of the guests trickled out, Melanie approached Jim, Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her expression was sincere. "Jim," she said softly, "I'm sorry. For everything." Jim studied her for a moment before nodding. "I know," he said simply. "And thanks for tonight." She smiled weakly. "You deserve it." As the house grew quiet again, Jim sat by the table, his medals gleaming in the dim light. For the first time in years he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: peace. The next morning, Jim stood in the backyard of the Harwell home, a coffee mug warming his hands as the rising sun bathed the property in golden light. For years he had walked this yard with a sense of loneliness, but today it felt different. The echoes of last night's gathering lingered, filling the air with a quiet sense of belonging. Melanie joined him, holding her own mug and wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. They stood in silence for a moment, the shared quiet between them no longer strained. "You know," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what General Hayes said, about how we need to do better. I don't think it's just about veterans. I think it's about family, too." Jim glanced at her, his face softening. "Maybe," he said. "Family's complicated." Melanie chuckled lightly. "That's one way to put it. I just want you to know, Jim, we're not going to sell the house. Brad and I talked about it last night. It doesn't feel right anymore." Jim's grip tightened on his mug, his throat constricting slightly. "You sure about that? It's a lot of money to walk away from." "We'll manage," she said, her voice firm. "Besides, it's not just a house, is it? It's home. For all of us." Jim nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thanks, Mel." Over the following weeks, Jim found himself at the center of a surprising whirlwind of activity. General Hayes had kept his word, rallying the local community to support veterans like Jim. It started with small things: a few neighbors stopping by to offer help around the house, others leaving handwritten notes of thanks in his mailbox. But then it grew. The local veterans shelter received a surge in donations thanks to Hayes's efforts to share Jim's story in the local paper. A feature article titled "The Forgotten Heroes Among Us" highlighted not just Jim's service but the broader issue of veteran neglect. Jim initially bristled at the attention. He wasn't used to being a symbol, and the idea of people pitying him made his skin crawl. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't pity, it was respect. And it felt good. One crisp Saturday morning, a group of volunteers gathered at the Harwell home to build something Jim hadn't expected: a small memorial garden in the backyard. At the center of it stood a stone monument, etched with the names of Jim's fallen brothers in arms, as well as a simple inscription: "In honor of those who served and sacrificed." Jim watched as the neighborhood came together, planting flowers, laying stones, and painting wooden benches. Even Brad, usually more interested in football than manual labor, rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Charlie, his old comrade, stood beside Jim, leaning on his cane. "Well, I'll be damned," Charlie said with a grin. "Didn't think I'd live to see something like this." It took effort to persuade Jim to leave. He hadn't been particularly emotional about leaving when he visited the juvenile patients. Jim chuckled, his gaze fixed on the monument. "Neither did I." By midday, the garden was complete. The volunteers gathered around the monument, their chatter fading into a respectful hush. Melanie stepped forward, holding a small box in her hands. She cleared her throat nervously. "Jim," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "this garden is for you and the men you served with. It's a way to say thank you, and to remind everyone in this community that your sacrifices matter." She opened the box, revealing a folded American flag. "We thought this should have a place of honor here." Jim stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the flag. He stared at it for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. This means more than I can say." As he placed the flag on the monument, a soft breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. The crowd broke into gentle applause, and for the first time in years, Jim felt a profound sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, the garden became a quiet gathering place for the community. Families visited to teach their children about sacrifice and service. Veterans found solace there, often sitting in silence on the benches, their thoughts their own. Jim found himself spending more time outside than he had in years. He took to gardening, tending to the flowers with a care he hadn't realized he possessed. The work was therapeutic, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt since coming home from Vietnam. One afternoon, Marie from the shelter stopped by with a young veteran named Chris. The man was in his 20s, his eyes shadowed by the same kind of pain Jim recognized all too well. "Chris just moved into the shelter," Marie explained. "I thought he might like to meet you." Jim shook the young man's hand firmly. "Welcome," he said simply. They spent the afternoon in the garden, Jim sharing stories about his unit, his struggles, and his hard-earned lessons. Chris listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. By the time he left, he seemed lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted. After Chris left, Jim sat on one of the benches, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the garden. Melanie joined him, handing him a glass of iced tea. "You've done something good here," she said. Jim nodded, his gaze on the monument. "It's not just me. It's everyone. Hayes, Charlie, you, even Brad." Melanie laughed softly. "Don't give Brad too much credit. He still complains about his back." Jim smiled. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The past would always be a part of him, but now it wasn't a burden. It was a legacy. One that would live on, not just in the garden, but in the lives of everyone it touched. And for Jim Harwell, that was enough.